it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to help equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about the question of how do we know Jesus was God is philosopher and theologian Kenneth Samples. Welcome, Ken.
Hi.
It's always good to have you here.
Thank you.
Christmas is approaching. It's
I
all
love
around
it.
us.
Yeah, I like
And
it.
one of the foundations of our faith is the great doctrine of what we call the incarnation.
Oh, yeah.
Where God came in the flesh.
Right.
So I thought we might spend a little time unpacking that. Maybe you could just kind of tell us a little bit more about why this belief is so important to our faith.
Yeah, I would say, Krista, that the incarnation is right up there with the Trinity in terms of being maybe the most distinctive Christian doctrine. So in Latin, carne, flesh, right? God has come in the flesh, the second person of the Trinity. The eternal Word, the Son of God, took on a human nature and became man. So we say that in the incarnation, Jesus is a single person with both a divine and human nature, two distinct natures.
Okay, so he's both God and human. Let's unpack that even a little bit more.
Sure.
How do we know that Jesus was God? Like, what's the evidence we could point to?
Yeah, this is a very important point. I think maybe the way to go at it is to recognize that Jesus himself had a self-consciousness of being divine. Jesus exhibits that in many ways. A powerful one is that he possesses the prerogatives of deity. For example, he claims to be able to forgive people's sins. The Jewish leaders say, who can forgive sin but God alone? He claims to hear and answer prayer. He claims to be able to raise the dead, judge humanity. So the things that only God can do, Jesus does. Therefore, Jesus is God.
Now, sometimes I hear skeptics say, well, there's really no verse you can point to where Jesus says, I am God.
Right.
So how might we address that concern?
Yeah, I think there's a very powerful way of addressing that issue, and that is in the Old Testament. For example, both in Exodus, but even more so in the book of Isaiah, Yahweh likes to be known. He likes to call himself I am or I am he. If you look at Isaiah 45 through 48, it's there a half a dozen times. John 8:58, Jesus and the Jewish religious leaders have a pretty tense conversation. Finally, they ask, who are you? And he says, before Abraham came into being, I am. He's reaching into the Old Testament and taking the most sacred name of God and applying it to himself. And in verse 59, what do? They pick up stones to stone him. Blasphemy. He's claiming deity for himself.
Very good. Now, I also have heard some people say, well, he uses this title, he's the Son of God.
Yeah.
And they kind of look at that as what he really means is I'm less than God, or I'm the God
Right.
Junior.
Right.
Like, how does this title, what does it reveal about who Jesus is?
That's another powerful evidence for Jesus being divine, because there's two titles, Son of God and Son of Man. Both of them are divine titles. In fact, Son of Man is even more popular than Son of God, but it doesn't mean that Jesus is a lesser version of God. To say you're the Son of God in a Jewish context would imply deity. And the same with the idea of the Son of Man, looking back to the Old Testament. So Jesus uses divine titles. He takes the most sacred name. He acts as if he can act on God's behalf. All of this cumulatively, I think, makes a solid support that Jesus saw himself as God in human flesh.
And it certainly seems that the early Christians saw him that way too, and
Yeah.
we talk about the title Jesus is Lord that was used in the early church. What doesn't seem like that was an invention hundreds of years later, that from the earliest times, instead of Caesar as Lord, it's Jesus as Lord.
That's a great point, a very important point. In the New Testament, when they talk about Jesus' lordship, they're comparing it to Yahweh. And so Jesus is the Lord God Almighty. So yeah, that's a very powerful piece of evidence.
So once again, the incarnation is one of what we call the great mysteries of our faith.
Right.
Not a contradiction,
Right.
but a mystery. And so some skeptics might be wondering, well, isn't a mystery the same as a contradiction? You pointed it out earlier, but I want to make sure we catch that.
Yeah, it's very important to realize that a contradiction is two statements that negate or deny one another. If you said, for example, Jesus is God but not God, he's man but not man, that would be a contradiction. But what the incarnation teaches is that Jesus is God and human, distinct. And so they're not negating one another. So Jesus is both God and man. He has two natures.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you for helping us explore the little bit deeper meaning behind this special time of year of Christmas.
Amen.
And I want to encourage you, go check out Ken's blog. Just go to our website, reasons.org, and search for Reflections.